It's time for Creation Ministries International, and this afternoon we have Dr. Don Batten on the line. Good afternoon, Dr. Don.
Good day, Mick. How are you going?
Awesome, and it's awesome to have you on the line today. Of course, for those who don't know who Dr. Don is, Dr. Don, he's the Creation Ministries speaker that we quite often have on the line here, and he has a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, first class honours, and his Ph.D. from the University of Sydney. Super smart, knows all about fruit and veggies and horticulture. And Dr. Don, I've got a really good question for you this afternoon. I thought, looking back at what you've done, and honestly, it was interesting, by the way, going through all the things that you've done. I thought, oh, here we go, look at this. It's got research projects and education and employment positions and publications, and then refereed papers published in science journals. And I thought, man, if I read all of that, I'd be reading more than a science journal just in reading all the things you've done.
Oh, that's very nice of you. But anyway, yeah, what's your question?
Well, the question is, because you know so much about fruit trees and veggies and all those sorts of things. I mean, so much of it talks about fruit trees. I have to ask, was the apple tree an actual apple tree? The one in the Garden of Eden?
Oh, yeah, a lot of people, you see it pictured a lot of the time as Eve's reaching out to grab the apple.
Yep.
But the Bible doesn't say apple tree. In fact, the Hebrew in the original has no indication it's an apple tree. It's called the tree of the knowledge of fruit, tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so it doesn't actually specify what sort of fruit it was, but it was just that. Adam was instructed not to eat from that tree. And in doing so, he deliberately went against what God told him to do. So it's like a test to say, you're going to do things my way, you're going to do things your own way. And Adam said, I'm going to do it my way. And he ate the fruit. But the interesting thing is, if just think about you're a kid and your mother's just made a chocolate cake, and she says, now, Mick, probably called you Michael, did she?
If I was in trouble, she did.
And she says, Mick, she says, that cake I've baked for visitors are coming this afternoon. Don't touch it. You have to wait till they come before you can have a piece, but just don't touch it. And anyway, you go running through the house chased by your sister and knock the cake over and it splatters on the floor.
This sounds like a real story.
And he comes in and finds a cake all over the place, a lovely cake she made for the visitors, and says, Mick, what have you done? Oh, it's not my fault. I didn't do it. And anyway, Mum has a bit of a problem because you were being chased by your sister. Is it the sister's fault or your fault or both your faults, or was anybody's fault? It was just an accident. And you think, well, she says, well, you shouldn't have been running through the house, but, you didn't deliberately knock the cake onto the floor and smash it to pieces. So, she might give you a tongue lashing, but, you're not sort of held guilty for breaking up the cake in a sense,
Uh-huh.
But she said to you, don't eat the cake. And then she comes in and she finds a big slice of the cake missing, and you've got chocolate cake all over your mouth.
That sounds like me as well, yeah.
And you say, I didn't mean to do it. I didn't mean to eat the cake. That wouldn't go down, would it?
No.
Your mother would say, you can't accidentally eat the cake. That's deliberate disobedience.
She would have got the wooden spoon out.
That's right, yes. Shh, don't tell everybody that. And
they were the days when you could.
They were the days when you could, yeah.
Yes.
So you get the difference between don't touch and don't eat. So you know what Satan said? Eve's actually twisted it. She said to Satan, God said, don't touch the tree.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But God said, don't eat from the fruit. So eating would be a deliberate act of disobedience. Accidentally touching it wouldn't be an act of disobedience.
Yeah.
And so it was a test. So the fruit is not stated. It's a tradition that goes back a long way that it was an apple tree. And it goes back because of the Latin Vulgate translation of Genesis. And apparently the fruit was called malus, which is sort of a generic term for fruit originally in the Latin. And then when they named the apple, they called it Malus. In the genus, M-A-L-U-S, Malus comes from the Latin, and of course that then links back to Genesis, and so consequently this tradition came about that the fruit in the garden was an apple fruit. But that's how it happened. It was just a mishmash of the Latin Vulgate translation, and that becomes a name for apple.
So in reality, it could have been like an avocado or a tomato or a mango.
It could have been anything. We don't know. We just don't know. But we know it must have been attractive because Eva looked at it and think that looks nice.
Yes.
And then she gave it to her husband, Adam, and then Adam was the one who deliberately disobeyed because he was the one instructed by God not to eat from it. So a deliberate act of disobedience, which of course brought about what we call the fall, which is the origin of sin and death and suffering and disease and everything in the world, entered into the paradise which they lived in at the time. And because God said to Adam, if you eat of that tree, death will come, you'll die. And he didn't die immediately, but he died quite a long time later.
Yep. But
the process of death began as they're excluded from the garden and excluded from God's presence and excluded from his renewing and maintaining presence. So God's presence maintains and renews things and keeps things functioning and eternal and very good. But you kick God out, things don't go well. Yep. And of course, we're seeing that again in our society today. I mean, we live in a country where we basically kick God out, and then people are wondering why there's all this juvenile crime and people breaking into houses with machetes and things, and all sorts of horrible things are happening. And we've basically done what Adam did back in the garden, was kick God out.
Yep.
And the Bible's actually full of accounts of what happens when you kick God out. The children of Israel did it many times, and every time they did it, things went belly up. And it's happened before, back before the great revivals in England and Europe and America. Things were really, really bad socially. A lot of crime, a lot of dysfunction, a lot of drunkenness, and the great revivals came and re-established God's central role in society, and then we reaped a harvest of good from that, which we're frittering away now.
Yeah.
So our politicians talk about what they're going to do to stop the crime and all this sort of thing. Meanwhile, they're basically trying to get rid of school scripture, and that's happened already in South Australia and Victoria. And there's plenty of politicians that like to get rid of it in New South Wales and Queensland as well, and Western Australia. And so, and of course, you get rid of God out of schools, and then you raise a generation of young people who become adults who have no knowledge of God. So if there's no God, why should you steal? In fact, they're actually taught evolution, which is survival of the fittest. So the whole of nature works on the principle of survival of the fittest, and nature red in tooth and claw. So you just claw your way to the top of the pile and do what you can while you can before you can't, before you become fertilizer.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is the culture we now live in, sadly.
Yes, absolutely. Why did God want to test Adam and Eve?
Well, philosophers and theologians have talked about this at length, but fundamentally it's a question of freedom. People say, God could have made Adam so he couldn't sin. Well, if he couldn't sin, he'd be just like a machine. Yeah. So there's no freedom. There's no freedom to love and to worship. You're just made to do that. I mean, they talk about AI, and you've got these robots and things which, become very human-like in many ways, but they're just programmed to do things. Yep. So, you press A, B, and C, you get D. Yep. And that's what happens. That's what happens with a program. So there's no. While the AI might seem like it's
human and has a personality, that's just programmed into it.
Yes.
It can't actually love you. It can't actually, of its volition, choose to like you and to love you. And that can only happen if there's freedom. And freedom means the freedom to not obey and freedom not to love. That's what the Garden of Eden's about. Adam and Eve had the freedom not to obey. They had the freedom not to love God. But that freedom then has a cost. When you make the wrong choices in life, there's a cost to be paid.
Yep. Now, you mentioned, machines. You were also going to talk today a little bit about machines.
Yes, the machines within living things are just amazing. I call them nanobots because the nanobots, because they're nano, they're really, really tiny. And bots are like robots. Nanobots is short for a nano-sized robot.
Yep.
So living things as cells, even the simplest cells like bacteria, have these machines, these nanobots, which are so small you can't see them under a light microscope. So you get your light microscope out in high school, in year 10 in high school, and you can see bacteria under the microscope. Mm-hmm. And you might even see some bacteria with little motors on them that swim around, called flagellum. You can see those swimming around under the microscope. But you can't actually see the operations of these motors inside the cell, and there's lots of them, and lots of them are absolutely necessary for life.
So how do you see them?
Well, this is where some very clever science comes in, and the scientists that are involved in working this out, brilliant people, absolutely brilliant people. For example, one of them is called ATP Synthase, and this is in all living things, and it suggests it's absolutely essential for life. And it's made up of a number of different proteins. Each of those proteins is made up of amino acids. So there's 20 different amino acids, but hundreds of these amino acids are programmed to be put together in the correct order to make each of the components to make the motor. But, to make those proteins, you need ATP, but you need the motor to make the ATP.
Yeah.
So how do you get the first motor? How do you get the first motors? Because you need multiple, you need lots of them, not just one.
Yeah.
In even just one cell. And these are just absolutely amazing. These motors. I mean, they work at they've calculated or measured that works at virtually 100% efficiency. I mean, engineers will say that's not possible, but it's virtually zero resistance. And our best electric motors run at about 90% efficiency, but your typical internal combustion engine on your car runs at like 20 to 30% efficiency. That sort of efficiency.
Yeah.
Pretty low by comparison. It's this ATP synthase. It's so small that 100,000 would sit side by side in a millimetre.
Yep. Yeah.
You just to try and imagine that. 100,000 would sit side by side in a millimetre.
Yes. Yeah. It's too many.
Yeah, well, that's why they're called nanotechnology, nanobots, nanomotors, because they're so small. So how do we know that it actually is a rotary motor? You can't see it under a light microscope, so how do we know? Well, lots of very clever experiments have been done, so working out what makes up the motor and how it's assembled together, and it was proposed that it was driven by an electric current of protons, which are positive current, unlike our motors have driven on electrons, which are negative current.
Yep.
And these protons flow through it and actually sort of a bit like wind in a windmill that actually causes the windmill to turn.
Yep.
It's sort of a bit like that. Or if you think a water wheel, the water causes the wheel to turn. So it turns it, and in the process of turning, it takes what's called ADP for short, and adds a phosphate to it to make ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is this energy-charged compound, which is necessary for life. In fact, our human bodies, make about half our body weight in a day of ATP.
Yep.
Think about that. So these little motors are spinning around inside our cells making this ATP, and then we need it for everything we do.
I've got to say, completely coincidentally, I was showing one of the ladies here today one of the creation videos that has pictures of these little motors working. And I also got onto, while I was searching for it, onto YouTube, and there's a lot of non-Christian sites that have virtually the same images. So it's not just a Christian theory. This is something that looks like it's very well known as far as how these little motors work. We're going to come back to Dr. Don Batten very shortly. We've just got to go in and have a weather report, traffic, and a couple of songs here. And we'll talk more about these little motors because they are absolutely intriguing. And we have Dr. Don Batten on the line from Creation Ministries International. And just before the break, we started talking about little motors that are inside people. And yes, I've seen some videos of them, and you can take a peek at them on the Creation website. Is that right, Dr. Don?
Yes, that's right. Yes, you look up nanobots on the website, and you'll find various. Find a video by me about a whole heap of them. But you'll also find links to animations which show you the ATP synthase we've just been talking about, and a number of others also. Kinesin's another one which is very interesting, which you actually can't think without kinesin, and nothing happens without it. But anyway, that's another one.
Wow. Now, as far as these...
You're asking how do we know the ATP synthase is a rotary motor?
Yes.
And that's interesting because there were some scientists who were evolutionists that said, it can't be a rotary motor because how could a rotary motor evolve?
That's right.
And that's a good question. How could it possibly evolve? It couldn't. But anyway, the people doing the research on this figured out that it's probably a rotary motor. How do you prove that? Because you can't actually see it. So the Japanese scientist attached a filament to the spinning part of the motor, so we sort of chemically attached a filament to it, and the filament, an actin filament it's called, it's got a little tag on it which if you shine UV light on it, ultraviolet light on it, it fluoresces in a visible light. So he actually engineered this to happen in a living cell, and then had this filament, like a bit of string, if you like, attached to the motor with this fluorescent thing on it, where you could look under a light microscope with some UV light shining on it, and you could see the fluorescent filament turned by the rotary motor of the ATP synthase.
Wow.
So he actually proved it was a rotary motor. That was a big breakthrough. But the guys who did most of the research shared the Nobel Prize for chemistry in the 90s for this.
Yep.
But the Japanese guy missed out. He didn't get a share.
Oh, wow.
Considering how important his finding was, I thought, anyway, the other one's got the Nobel Prize for it. But here's the thing. Very, very clever scientists are actually involved in working this stuff out. And yet they could never, ever have dreamt or imagined or designed that motor.
Yeah.
It's far beyond our ability. Far, far beyond our ability to even dream of inventing such a motor. And they're doing clever science to work out how it works. And there's still stuff to be discovered about how it works. But yet, how can you believe in evolution when you're studying this stuff? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, even the videos I was looking at today, there's a lot of videos online, from scientists that are not Christians. And they're showing this stuff, and you sort of look at it and think, doesn't this make it obvious to you? But somehow it doesn't.
Yeah, there's a blindness there, and it defies logic to think that these things could have made themselves, which is basically what evolution's about. Evolution's about everything made itself without God, and it doesn't make any sense whatsoever of the evidence. The evidence it just shouts at it that an incredibly intelligent, supremely intelligent creator, far above our ability, that actually invented these things.
Mm.
And there's a whole heap of these that have to be present at the same time in multiple copies for the first living cell to exist. There's one called helicase, which, the DNA is a double helix, so it's two strands twisted around one another.
Yep.
So if you think about a bit of string, where three strands and a bit of string, and you're going to untwist the strands so there's a single strand that's not actually wrapped around the others.
Yep.
if you grab a couple of those strands and start pulling them apart, what happens? You get a knot down the bottom, don't you?
Yes.
Right. So, helicase untwists the DNA, but in the untwisting process, it can generate a knot down the bottom, so it actually stops the process. Well, there's actually one called topoisomerase, which is a big mouthful, but topoisomerase actually denots the DNA. It actually cuts the DNA and untwists it so that there's no knot formed.
Wow.
Can you imagine that? So this is a phenomenally complex motor, much more complex than ATP synthase. Now, every living thing has this. It has helicase, it has ATP synthase, and without ATP synthase, which makes ATP, there's nothing to actually drive the helicase or the topoisomerase, both of which use ATP. And so if you can't actually untwist the DNA to read it to make proteins, you don't have anything happening. And if you can't untwist the DNA and read it to copy it so you can actually reproduction, so cells can reproduce or life can reproduce, then you don't have life.
Yeah.
And these things are absolutely necessary for every living thing. You can't have life without them, and yet they just scream at us that they're made by a creator far above us in intelligence. Far above us in intelligence.
Yeah.
You just look at it and say, wow, how amazing is our creator? How amazing is our creator?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you know, we were just last week talking to Ron Neller and, talking about some stuff in regards to, you know, these little machines blow my mind, I've got to say. The machines are one thing that just, you realise there's so many of them in there. And with, you know, Ron Neller, we were talking about how everything breaks down over time. You know, even people, we're not as good as we used to be. Everything's breaking down over time. And if all these little machines are in us, we can understand, you know, things breaking down over time, over generations. You know, there's DNA that comes back that's not as good, but we've never seen it actually grow. We've never seen these little machines you're talking about, there's no new ones being created, is there? Apart from the identical ones that they make.
Yeah, there's nothing new. There's no new machines. There's no new chemical pathways. There's no new enzymes. There's modified existing ones, which sometimes can be beneficial. So the idea there's no beneficial mutations, that's not a wise thing to say. Mm-hmm. But even the beneficial mutations are just slight modifications of existing things. They're not actually creating anything new. As somebody said, mutations break things, they don't make things. And mutations are the only mechanism they have to try and explain all this incredible complexity in living things, even the simplest living things. Just mind-boggling. You know, you're thinking thoughts right now. I hope you are.
What's that?
You're thinking thoughts right now.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it's ticking through my brain, and I'm actually piecing together what we were talking about last week with what we're talking about this week, and it's just making so much sense. You know, the way we sort of over the generations since really Adam and Eve, I guess we've seen, you know, humans devolving, not evolving. And, of course, these little machines have been there all the time, but there's no new ones happening. And I'm sort of putting all this together in my head. And it's there's lots of colourful things going on.
Yeah, well, those thoughts require another machine or another nanobot called kinesin. And kinesin is responsible, you might have seen their animations, this thing walking along inside the cell.
Yes.
And
it looks like he's got a big bag over his shoulder.
That's the one, that's the one, kinesin. So the big bag has got proteins in it, and it's delivering proteins to a destination. But the proteins are actually manufactured with an address label on to say where to go to, and the cell reads the address label, packages them up, and sends them off to a destination. So there's a whole lot of these different kinesins, and by the way, the animation shows it plodding along, but it actually does about 100 steps per second.
Oh, wow.
So there's 125,000 steps in a millimetre. So that sort of gives you the size we're talking about.
Yeah, they've got a long way to walk.
Yeah, but 100 steps per second, it's actually very quick. In fact, it's so quick, when you put your hand on a hot plate, right?
Yep.
How long does it take for you to actually react and pull your hand off the hot plate?
Oh, it feels immediate, but I'm sure you get burnt first.
Well, it's a 0.2 of a second or something. It's very quick, isn't it? It might be long enough to get burnt, but you're very quick to take your hand away.
Yes.
Well, what happens in that? So your nerves have sent a signal to your brain saying, "Stupid, your finger is burning."
Yes.
And then your brain sends a message back saying, "Pull your finger away, you idiot."
Yes.
And so you pull your finger away. All happens within, a fraction of a second. Well, how does that... In your brain, there's about 100 different neurotransmitters that are involved in determining your thoughts. And in the process of thinking that through in that fraction of a second, kinesins have picked up the appropriate neurotransmitters and dumped them between the synapses of the nerves to tell the next nerve what to do, and then the signal goes back to your finger to contract the muscle and pull it away. All of which happens, and these kinesins are involved in transferring these chemicals between the synapses in your brain for that to happen. So how fast does it happen? Very, very fast.
I can imagine they're flying. And, of course, I really think anyone listening right now, you've got to Google the what do you Google? What do you type in to get this video to come up? Because the video, just looking at the video, you'll understand exactly what we're talking about. And honestly, it doesn't take long to realise, hey, there's no way that this could happen by chance. But what would you type in to get this to come up?
Well, go to creation.com and you can type in, you want that particular one, you can type in kinesin, which is Kinesin, just as it sounds, Kinesin, kinesin. Or type in nanobots, you'll get my video, which actually goes into a number of these different machines that are in living cells. And underneath the video on creation.com, you'll find links to articles which actually give you their animations and things showing you these different animations like the kinesin and the ATP synthase and different things like that.
Yep.
So there's lots of stuff there, and as you say, this is just something we've made up. I mean, this is something that secular scientists have been working on for decades.
Yep.
And revealing this amazing creation, amazing design in living things. And it's not controversial. I mean, what I've said today, none of that is controversial. That is all mainstream science.
Yep. It's more science pointing to the Bible and saying, hey, what the Bible has said is correct.
Correct.
Not the other way.
We are fearfully and wonderfully made. We're not just a concoction of accidents.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, well, Dr. Don, we've got to that time of day where we're going to have to say goodbye and say thank you. That is absolutely awesome, and looking forward to speaking to you again next week.